right, y'all, welcome back. Friday, day after the test, last day for this week. Getting close to the end of the year, but also we are now getting close to the end of the Israelites. Hopefully the test wasn't the end of your good grades in this class, but here it is, the beginning of the end as promised for the poor Israelite, the last remnants in the south. So Isaiah is describing, if you remember from Wednesday, Isaiah is describing the long-awaited Messiah who's going to get us back to the glory days of David and going to end the suffering of God's people. Except it's not happening. And you think about like where we're at with the coronavirus, and you keep hearing things might be getting better, things might be getting better, and yet you also, I don't know if you heard, the archdiocese furloughed some of the employees. People are getting nervous about the stimulus checks. Like there's this uneasiness, and that's what's kind of going on with the people of Israel, the people of Judah in the south at this time, is that they're getting uneasy about when is this Savior gonna come, and so they start asking these questions. And Isaiah says, "Look, it's not what you think. It's not going to be this mighty hero king that's going to come in and solve all of our problems. In fact, this Messiah is going to come in as a suffering servant who's going to come in and serve, like rather than be served, he's going to serve himself. Like he's going to not serve himself, right? He himself is going to serve the people." And he describes the actions of this great Messiah as being willing to suffer and ultimately die for the sake of Israel. But through this suffering, right, everyone is saved. Now, as a Christian in the year 2020, if you read this, your mind should go completely straight to Christ, right? You're like, okay, there it is. Like we know who he was talking about. At the time, though, right, they don't understand that, and they just hear about the suffering servant who's going to be put to death, and he's going to, and in that, it's going to heal the wounds and the sins of the people and everything they put right. That doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Like if you were to say today, yeah, we're going to solve this coronavirus crisis not by finding the cure or not by developing a vaccine or a stimulus program. What we're really going to do is we're going to find this one guy who's going to like get the coronavirus for the sake of everybody, and in that somehow like puts everything back to normal. I don't know, I'm making this up at the spot. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So you can't blame the Israelite people when Christ does come as a suffering servant for not really recognizing Isaiah's words. We recognize it, but they don't quite see it that way. Now, there are some scholars that talk about the fact that what Isaiah is really referring to is not so much Christ, although it is similar to Christ, but that he's talking about Israel as a nation. That Israel herself is the suffering servant that will bring the entire world into harmony and peace and the forgiveness of sins by making God known. And that's not a wrong interpretation either. So I just throwing that out there as well. But what really happens? Well, the Messiah doesn't come. The Savior isn't here yet. And Judah, the last remnant, falls to the Babylonians. So not the Assyrians, but the Babylonians. And so you may have heard of the Babylonian exile before. This is what's taking place now. And so the Jews now are captured, and they're going to live as slaves in Babylon. If you remember, Babylon, not a good place. This kind of seems like the ultimate defeat of God's people, God's chosen people in the promised land, the greatest God. The southern kingdom is gone, the northern kingdom is gone. Both are slaves. Everything is gone, including the temple. Remember the great big temple where God is. That's destroyed. So there's only one conclusion then. If God's promised people and the promised land with the big temple where God dwells, if all that's over, well, is God over? Is God dead? And that's the question that the Israelites are struggling with for the rest of, you could say, the rest of their existence here is, what happened? I thought God was always going to remain faithful to his covenant, but it sure doesn't seem like things are going according to plan here. It couldn't have been God's plan for us to be captured by the Assyrians in the north, the Babylonians in the south, for the temple to be destroyed, for all of us to live in exile. How is that God keeping his plan to make of us a great nation, to bring about our redemption? Doesn't seem like that is the case. And so there's this great mourning of the loss of what they have, and there's this great confusion about the future. So the final points, and here it is: the beginning of the end of the beginning. Everything from this point on is going to be, I would say, like an addition or an addendum to these points, right? So these are kind of the final points that you need to know for this period of Israel's history. Is that God has a plan. Don't worry. God's plans are gradual plans. And you can see this, right? I think I gave this analogy before. Watching my daughter grow up, it would be weird, right? Like if you came out as a baby and you just knew everything. Humans are gradual creatures. We walk and then we crawl. We crawl and then we walk, right? And then we run. You learn to ride a bike with training wheels and you take them off. God is forming his people through the covenants to understand who he is and to prepare his people to, you could say, fully understand who he is and his plans. And then this last point, right? The many centuries that preceded the advent of the Messiah really just means all of this time before Christ is a time of gradual preparation to know and understand the redemption brought by Christ. Okay? And so the important thing to remember is not, or put it this way, is that it's not that God has abandoned his people. It's the opposite. It's that God is allowing his people to become most fully themselves. And this is a point that we've kind of, entered into and come out of a couple times, is that you've got to let, as a parent, I have to let my daughter make her own choices, sometimes own mistakes. Right now it's pretty difficult to let her do that because she's not even 2. But you are in a different position, right? Like you are at a point where your increasing freedom also leads to increasing mistakes. Some of you, you know who I'm talking about, you've already experienced this, right? Like where you made some decision that resulted in a negative consequence. And you might say, well, why was I allowed to make that decision? Why was I allowed to fall into this trouble? Well, sometimes in that freedom that doesn't always result in success, you better understand your relationship, whether it's to your parents, to authority, to the rules, right? Or to what's ultimately going to matter. And what you're going to see in the exile period is that the Israelites come to understand who they are even more than they did in this previous time, right? Because we had a lot of really bad kings. You saw that in the Bible Project video. We had a lot of guys that didn't quite get it. But now that everything glorious has been taken away, now that they're in that moment of exile and despair and destruction that Isaiah predicted, they start to piece things together. And what you're going to see in the notes that we're going to do towards the end of this year is that in piecing those things together, they get closer and closer to Christ. And then, of course, we have the New Testament where Christ does, in fact, arrive. Okay, so that's it for today. There will be a little bit of notes in the lecture notes talking about the test and just some of the things that we're going to review from the test. But other than that, guys, I'm going to give you the weekend off because we just had the test on Thursday. And I will see you next week on Monday where we talk about the final things in the Old Testament. All right, guys, have a great weekend. See you on Monday.